At the southern end of the golden plains of Westfall lies the charming and quiet town of Moonbrook. Not all is as wholesome as it seems from a distance, however, as beneath the town lay the Deadmines. Once a hub of industry for the hard-working people of Stormwind, but now the hiding place of one of its greatest enemies in the Defias Brotherhood. I'm Shuppzy, and today in Warcraft Space and Story, I'm joined by Destron, the author of the Travels Through Azeroth and Outland. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it's a tour through the zones and lands of Azeroth from the point of view of a Forsaken scholar. I absolutely recommend you guys check it out, because it just adds so much depth and character to the world. But enough gushing, I'll let the man introduce himself.
Hi, thanks Shuppzy. I'm Destron, and I'm very happy to be here. I've enjoyed these videos for quite a while, and I wanted to contribute my own insight into Westfall and the Deadmines, particularly because I came to it more from vanilla. I'm not that experienced with the Cataclysm version, so I can compare and contrast the older Deadmines with the newer ones. Also, I experienced the Deadmines in its very first iteration, way back in the dark days of the early 90s with Warcraft 1, which actually did have a few dungeon missions. So, anyway, without further ado, let's get started, and I'm honored to be along for the ride. So tranquil looking.
Exactly. So Moonbrook, as we see it today, even though it's beautiful and tranquil, as you said, from a distance, what we find within it are homeless, refugees, petty criminals, small-time thieves.
That tells you right off that this Moonbrook still has a lot of the same problems you see throughout Stormwind, really, but especially in Westfall.
Exactly. So what would we have originally seen coming through Moonbrook?
Yeah, so Moonbrook back then was a very different story. That was not a quiet town with a poverty problem. That was a town that had been completely taken over by the Defias. But the moment you stepped in, there was no doubt who was in charge, because there'd be a red-masked Defias wizard very ready and willing to throw a fireball right in your face. And that happened to me many times. So it's quite a contrast. It shows in a way how Varian's return to Stormwind has improved things somewhat, but he hasn't necessarily fixed all of the problems at the center.
So what we're looking at here and what we're approaching is the barn of Moonbrook, and even if you're a brand new player to the area, you can tell by its size and structure that it's the most important building in the town, and you're almost drawn to it even if you don't know why you're heading there.
The road seems to kind of lead to the barn as well, so it's definitely funneling you into this building. I also noticed that lamppost, there's a skull nail to it, which is another indication that there's something seriously wrong with this town.
Yes, absolutely. It's the first sign of sort of violence, not just poverty. And speaking of violence, we walk into the barn itself and immediately find an armed thug. So a step up from, the small-time hustlers and hobos we've seen thus far. So it raises the danger as you begin progressing towards the Deadmines.
It does kind of tie into the Dust Bowl feel of this zone.
Absolutely, and that's really worth talking about, because the importance of Westfall and Deadmines is to really highlight what it means to be not so much an alliance player, maybe more specifically a human player, similar to what the Barons does for the Horde. So Elven Forest is your very stereotypical medieval fantasy forest, but then you start getting into Westfall, and it carries some of those themes, but it starts playing with these sort of Western Dust Bowl themes as well, which is really a strength of the Warcraft franchise in general, to be able to mix themes from all sorts of different genres and still create a living and cohesive world.
Yeah, and that adds to the character, and they do other things in Stormwind as well, because once you get into Duskwood, it starts sort of venturing into a more gothic horror feel, which is distinct from the other themes presented, but still fits with them in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the pre-dungeon of Deadmines is mostly a continuation of Moonbrook, but as you see just the length and scope of these mines hidden underneath the town, you see bits and pieces of further industry. You might see some sort of steam pipes and things that make you wonder how exactly they got into what seems to be an abandoned mine under a small town.
Right. And you wonder also how long it's been abandoned. Should I go into the Warcraft 1 version right now?
Yeah.
Would this be a good place for that? Okay. So in Warcraft 1, there are actually two Deadmines missions, one for each campaign, human and orc. The human version actually had you go in to rescue Anduin Lothar, leader of the humans in the Second War, and a pretty major lore figure. The orc version had you going in to assassinate Blackhand's daughter, who had shamed the horde by running off with an ogre. It's worth noting back when that ogres and orcs were considered to be mortal enemies. So the Deadmines in that game were really just a series of caverns, and this is probably because of graphical limitations. You didn't see much, if anything, in the way of mining infrastructure. It actually looked kind of like the map. So here, some of it is just the modern technology allows them to present a more detailed universe, but it's not clear exactly how long the Deadmines have been dead, so to speak.
So what I find rather interesting is that we have this approach to the instance portal here, and it's mostly hidden by the bridge, and you just sort of get peeks of it through the arm rails of the bridge, and then you see it from this little overlook here. So it does play into the theme of this being a lair and a hideout, because the way in there is just sort of tucked away in this little corner, and I think that works quite well with the theme of the whole dungeon, or feel of the whole dungeon. And as we enter the dungeon proper, we're given a few paths and a few twists and turns, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. Then all of a sudden you get that big cannon blast, and it's again going, hey, over here, this is where your adventure is. And I think that's a really good way of leading the players.
It's good. This was a new addition to the Cataclysm version, I believe, since the vanilla version did not have there was a cannon, but not right up front shooting at you like this. So it definitely shows that the Defias means business.
Speaking of, we've made a lot of noise about the Defias thus far, but as you enter, the first thing you encounter are ogres and kobolds. In fact, this kobold's being used as a lighter here. So it's almost a bit of a fake out for everyone coming in here and thinking, oh, I'm going to find the Defias, I'm going to wipe them out sort of thing. To find ogres and kobolds, which you could find in pretty much everywhere on Azeroth.
Yeah, like I said earlier, the ogres were the primary inhabitants of the Deadmines in Warcraft 1. Basically, it's just them and some slimes. So this is a callback to that. And it also shows just how successful the ogres have been, because while not very smart, they are very strong and can be used as leg breakers or goons for pretty much any faction that can feed them.
And we approach our first boss, Glubtok, now. So, I'm talking about sort of hints to previous stories. Glubtok is an ogre mage. Most of them were originally part of the Twilight's Hammer, but in more than a few cases you see that some have struck their own path or joined other organizations. So Glubtok here may very well have been part of the original ogre occupation of the Deadmines, dating all the way back to Warcraft 1, but he's managed to survive and has eventually risen through the ranks of the Defias and become the foreman of the ogre section of the mines.
Could be. An ogre mage would be a more useful foreman than a regular ogre, certainly, since I'm not sure a regular ogre would have the foresight or planning ability to really do a very good job. Ogres, it's more just, if you want something beaten to a pulp, there's no one better, but if you want someone to keep track of who's doing what, well, this is one case where two heads would definitely be better than one.
Absolutely, and it's an escalation compared to the original boss that was here, Rakzor, who was just an ogre bruiser. And from Glubtok, we enter the goblin section of the mine, and a few things stand out immediately. First, we've got the mining monkeys. So, it's a little bit odd, but it is humorous. Goblins do tend to be on the lighter side of themes and storylines in WoW, and there is a potential sort of storyline continuation. Originally, all the goblins in the Deadmines were from the Venture Company, but as of Cataclysm, it's very likely they are Bilgewater goblins who've abandoned the Horde, or at least didn't sign up. So for those of you who've played a goblin, you'll know you end up on the Lost Isles at a certain point, and a group of monkeys ends up getting enslaved / slightly sort of intellectually elevated by the goblins there. So there is some potential continuation, but for the most part, it's a bit sort of on the nose, I feel.
Yeah, humor has always been a big part of Warcraft, and to its benefit. I mean, one of the things everyone remembers from the old games is just clicking on a unit too many times to hear the funny things they say. And this continued in World of Warcraft. I thought Cataclysm took it a bit too far, simply because Westfall tells the story very well. I mean, you see a once wealthy region just reduced to penury because of the Defias. Once safe farms suddenly deadly and ruined. But now monkey miners, it kind of yanks you out of the narrative, I think. And here's the mask room, which was also present in the original. And back then, they did not have hobgoblins. Instead, they had shredders. Hobgoblins were added in Kata. And visually, this is interesting because the boss here is riding a hobgoblin, whereas in the vanilla days, the goblin boss was riding a shredder. So it's a visual callback that also updates the area for the storyline of Cataclysm.
Absolutely, there's the sort of through line of the actual boss is a little guy in a big thing that looks much scarier than him. So the boss we do have here is Helix Gearbreaker. So not too much is known about him, but he's found his way to the Defias and found himself a pretty cushy job managing the Master Room. And the Master Room itself is rather interesting because it's just hints towards the amount and different layers of industry that's in the Deadmines. For a fairly out-of-the-way place, there's been a lot invested by both the Kingdom of Stormwind and the Defias Brotherhood in getting many different kinds of industry into this place.
You do wonder how they got through all those tunnels, which sort of hints at what the player runs into later.
And we enter our next section of the mines, and here we find powder kegs, stacks of cannonballs, so it's a little bit more military and it's raising the danger. And we also find the Defias for the first time. So we've got these Defias wizards, we've got peasants, and what's interesting about the peasants is they use these really old sort of Warcraft 3 reminiscent models. For those of you unfamiliar, Westfall is, as Blizzard said, the first zone they made, and by extension the Deadmines is the first dungeon they finished. So they've got a lot of these older models that maybe they haven't had the heart to remove, which I think is rather nice.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that, but they do look different. Here with, you're seeing a lot more militarization. The miners here look more, they're human, so they're they're smarter than ogres and maybe more reliable than goblins. So clearly this is where the more serious work is being done.
Now there's something I really want to note. So the Defias have the iconic red handkerchief, but for the most part their armor for the fighters and actual thieves tends to be blacks and sort of muted browns and golds and that. And that's good because it sets up a direct contrast to the Alliance's, or especially Stormwind's, blue and gold, and also it's reminiscent of the Horde's colours. So players coming through here for the first time are sort of being taught in a way that red and black is your enemy. You are blue and gold, they are red and black.
Yeah, it's good early game conditioning. And here, the Foundry, this is a pretty impressive piece of industry, actually.
The sort of big reveal of the Foundry is those doors swing open, you got this massive thing in front of you. Is very, very impressive.
And you have to be wondering, what are they building with all this? They have, the lumber, the ore mining, and now some kind of smelting capacity. So they really are building something.
And what we're looking at here is one of the harvest golems, which we've talked about a few times before, but these really are iconic of Westfall in general.
Absolutely. One of the first things you really notice one of the first signs that something is wrong is looking at these berserk scarecrows rampaging through the fields. It looks like the farm itself had suddenly taken sentience and thrown off its occupants. You have a wheat rotting in the fields while the harvest golems just go about and attack anybody who comes too close. So it looks like here they've turned against their masters because there's a lot of dead goblins. Is that what happens with the Kata version?
Absolutely. So this room is referred to specifically as the Goblin Foundry. As you saw, some goblins ran out at us as soon as the doors opened, and there's dead bodies laying around. So the original boss in here was a goblin by the name of Gilnid, and Gilnid was reported to be a master of engineering and machines. So in some way it seems his machines have turned on him, they've turned against their master, and this is the result.
Yeah, clearly people in Warcraft have not had the benefit of watching Terminator.
Absolutely, and what we're looking at here is the Foe Reaper 5000. So the biggest, most important, and most sort of military looking of the Harvest Golems. He doesn't have the big scarecrow suit on, he doesn't have the hat, he just looks like a machine of war. And we enter yet another tunnel of the Deadmines, and here we've got more Defias, but now there's no industry going on, they're ready, they're waiting, and they're armed. So again, the danger is escalating, we're really making progress towards something.
Yeah, this is where they hold back the more elite soldiers. I remember this from Vanilla, that's a good holdover. And it was an interesting setup for what's beyond the door. Funny that the doors open inward after being shot.
There's only so many things you can do with vanilla assets.
I suppose so.
So this is the Sea Dock and the Ogre Juggernaut that we see in front of us that's been built by the Defias and Venture Company and all their allies. We were talking about mixing themes as well earlier, and I think this is a great example of that. The Defias is simultaneously a pirate crew, a workers' revolt, a street gang, an organized crime syndicate, all these various unsavory aspects of society rolled into one, but it still all somehow works, and it still all plays together into itself really nicely.
And it makes sense because in real life, a lot of times rebellions will rely on criminal groups just to get supplies or information, just because they're both against the law already. So there's not too much incentive for them not to cooperate on some level. And that's a very good point.
Now the cannons here, they add a sort of real danger to navigating the space, and I think that's quite cool because there's a lot of mechanical dynamism and visual dynamism that's been added in Cataclysm, and this is a perfect example because every time you take a few steps you get that massive shake of the ground and you have to avoid being hit, otherwise you take a massive chunk of your health and get blown back. So it makes getting through this space quite nice.
Yeah, the cannons were not there in vanilla. That's definitely an improvement in Cataclysm.
So the Ogre Juggernaut that we see, we don't exactly know if it was left here by the old Horde and Defias has been working on it, or if it's a construction of their own, but either way it is symbolic. So the whole idea of the Defias, especially under Edwin Van Cleef originally, was to build this thing and to go demolish Stormwind. And it is symbolic because the Juggernaut is obviously a tool of the Horde, a tool of the army that originally destroyed Stormwind the first time.
Yeah, and plus Juggernauts are just very intimidating. They were kind of scary looking even in Warcraft 2.
As imposing and as sort of eye-drawing as the Juggernaut is, it's still worth looking around the Sea Dock itself, because you've seen interesting things. The change in space, you've got sort of this blue highlight among the higher areas, and you've got this massive sea gate. Now, what I find kind of interesting, and I haven't been able to see any confirmation one way or the other, is that the architecture on that sea gate matches exactly to the architecture on Thoradin's wall. So this could very possibly be something dating back to that time. You know, the original Arathor nobles that came down to Stormwind may have built this sea gate. Otherwise, it may just be sort of Blizzard reusing assets. We may never know on that aspect.
Yeah, or it could just be using the same style because it's the builders using the same type of architecture simply because it's durable. Thoradin's wall stood for a long time after all, so clearly they were doing something right.
And here we approach where Mr. Smite would have originally stood. So Mr. Smite was a real fan favourite of the original dungeon, being, as far as we can tell, a Grim Totem Tauren, though he may very well have been a Tauren of any kind that just happened to have black fur. Grim Totem, for the most part, seem willing to work with outsiders, but more focused on Kalimdor, so it does seem a little bit odd that he's gone all the way to the other end of the world, literally, to work for the Defias.
Maybe there's some kind of outlaw exchange program?
Absolutely. Oh, that'd be outlaw internships. And here we have the Defias pirates themselves. So again, that's what I was saying. The Defias maintain a pirate crew. They maintain all these different aspects of their criminal organization. And they seem relatively good at training up the various aspects.
Yeah, that active cannons, even though they no longer really affect you, like you said, they do contribute to the dynamism.
Yes, absolutely. You can actually hijack the cannons and turn them on their masters as well. So there's a little bit of...
Oh, really? That's cool.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think you could do that in vanilla. It does add to the swashbuckling atmosphere, and if you look at any of the old pirate movies where people are swinging from one ship to the other, there's a great sense of movement, and kudos to Blizzard for being able to capture that to at least some degree in an MMO, because MMOs aren't really geared toward that kind of activity.
And the ascension up towards the deck of the ship here is really good. As you're sort of winding your way up, you're going up a little bit, then around, then up a little bit and around, and it sort of builds that sense of escalation. You can't ever properly see what's up there, because even when you get to the highest level, you've got these barrels and crates and everything that only allow you the tiniest glimpses of what's up there. And when we finally do make that final approach, we find Admiral Ripsnarl. So Ripsnarl you actually encounter throughout questing in Westfall. You find him locked up in stocks at Sentinel Hill, I believe, and he gets freed by the leader of the Defias and empowered to become the Admiral. So Ripsnarl is a Worgen, Gilnean Worgen obviously, and encountering him just sort of wandering alone throughout Westfall does make you think what led him here all the way from his homeland of Gilneas or even his his people's new adopted homeland of Darnassus and Teldrassil. So there's a hint towards something dark in his backstory that gets expanded on a little bit later in the dungeon.
Yeah.
The counterpart to Admiral Ripsnarl was originally Captain Greenskin. So Captain Greenskin is another goblin. Goblins seem to have some success as pirates and privateers and, seabound merchants, so it does make sense to elevate one of them to the position of captain. And it makes sense that he's leading a lot of his brethren at the same time.
Here we are, the Murloc representative of the Defias, and the Murlocs are probably the only race more successful than the ogres. They are literally everywhere.
And here we've got Captain Cookie. So Cookie, as you might guess from the name, is the ship's cook, and an odd job for a Murloc, but one he seems to be doing well enough. Someone's obviously stuck a little pirate hat on him and told him he's the captain now. Yeah,
he's a carryover from Vanilla. He's one of the few bosses, I think the only boss that was around for both.
Again, like Mr. Smite, another real fan favourite there. It's very humorous, but it works here because it's a little moment of levity just before you get to the real climax of the Deadmines story.
It's integrated into the gameplay.
As soon as you kill Captain Cookie, a note drops mysteriously to the floor. The game leads you over to look at it and read it. And as you're looking down, you hear a voice from above you. You look up and all of a sudden, there's Vanessa Van Cleef, the true final boss of the Deadmines. It lends a real cinematic quality to the reveal of this character, and I think it's very, very well done.
I find it interesting that when you see her, she's sitting on top of that doorway, which is much too big. It gives her an almost childlike appearance because her feet are dangling so far off the ground. I don't know whether this is because a function of living on an ogre-sized ship, or a ship built for ogre proportions, or if it's to hint that she's not quite her own. I mean, she's too locked into her father's presence. Like she's just a successor to Edwin, but not really her own person.
Well, Vanessa Van Cleef, even if she doesn't have maybe the leadership and direct charisma of her father, still has managed to band together enough of these allies and enough of these sort of disparate peoples. Part of that may be her success as a master of toxins, especially neurological toxins and poisons, as she does to the player here in what I think is a really sort of, in the design aspect, interesting sequence, as you're locked into this nightmare and the various nightmares of all the bosses you've encountered and sent back through half the dungeon.
Right. It's an interesting addition, and it was a little surprising for me just because I never saw the Defias as being the kind of faction to mess with your head. But now that I've given it some more thought, it does make sense given that the new Defias is much more of a subversive organization rather than one based on open rebellion.
And the first nightmare we have to fight our way through is Glubtop. One of the successes, in a sense, of the nightmare sequence, in my opinion, is that for the most part, modern Deadmines exists because the original Deadmines was popular. And there's not too much real storyline or heart to it beyond just, hey, we're doing this again. But this nightmare sequence gives a lot of, or at least attempts to give a lot of heart and a lot of depth to the story. Because in Glubtop's nightmare, we find that he's actually afraid of his own destructive powers, and we're told that his ogre mound was burnt down by him accidentally, and that's why he's fled his past and come here and signed on to something where his destructive powers at least are welcomed. He doesn't have to be afraid of them for the rest of his life.
Right. And in a sense, Vanessa almost becomes like an inspirational figure for some of these people because, she took folks like Glubtop who had screwed up so badly as to essentially ruin their lives and given them a second chance, even if that chance was aimed toward destructive ends.
With Glubtop dead again, the nightmare shifts to Helix. And this is cool because you're already looking at him and you see him cowering in fright of something behind you. You check behind you, nothing's there. Then he perks up, you look behind you again, and spiders. So in a world of such massive, horrific, void threats, old gods and dragons and everything, spiders are a relatively common thing to be afraid of, but as you have dozens of them, massive ones descending down on you, you can't help but share a little bit of Helix's fright.
Yeah, I actually rather like spiders, but I would still be alarmed if I saw that many spiders of that size rushing toward me, either in a game or in real life.
And now we get to Foe Reaper's Nightmare, or Nightmare of Sorts. There's a real attempt to humanize the bosses, to give them a little bit more depth, and in this case we've got humanization through personification, because Vanessa asks us as we enter, can you imagine the life of a machine? A single spark could mean the difference between life and death. And that's reflected in this almost sort of arcade game little maze here as you have to dodge the giant spinning laser walls. And at the beginning of Ripsnarl's nightmare, we find him as he was, James Norrington, a scared, helpless man, and it really makes you wonder what's happened. And as the doors open, you get a sense for it. So, Ripsnarl's story is enhanced through tragedy, as we see groups of feral worgen attacking his daughter, his son. Eventually you find him holding his wife by the throat. He's now a feral worgen, and the implication is that he was the one to finally kill her. So all of a sudden it hits you and the weight drops and you get a sense of why he'd be wandering so far away from home and be morally scarred enough to sign on to a group like the Defias.
Right. Which, again, another person who does not see themselves having any future, who can't forgive themselves, finding second chance with this band of cutthroats.
And finally, we make our way back to Vanessa Van Cleef. So even though she claims to not be as good of a fighter as her father was, she calls upon other Defias pirates and bandits and that to help in the battle. So she is still a capable enough leader of the Defias, and she's got all her tricks and traps and everything that makes her a very dangerous foe unto herself.
Right. It's the first fight with Van Cleef in Vanilla era Deadmines was pretty intense. So maintaining that would be important.
So I was talking about Vanessa's planning ability and ability to lay traps and set up things. She's actually rigged the entire ship with explosives as a sort of contingency for such a thing. And in a real nod to the swashbuckling feel of this section of the dungeon, you get to swing away on these rope bridges to avoid the damage from the explosions and then swing back and fight among the fiery deck of the ship now. And it gives a more dramatic and escalating feel to this part of the dungeon.
And with Vanessa dead, we close the story of the Deadmines, and the game invites us to use this alternate exit and give us some time to really reflect on what the dungeon was. I think in both variations, there was a sort of consistent theme and intended feeling at this point of more problems ahead. In the original, the problems were smaller but perhaps more real in a sense. There was the issue of ascendancy, with Anduin coming to the throne and perhaps not being fit. There was the issue of corrupt nobility, in fact the same nobility that led to the formation of the Defias in the first place. And there was just the question of, what do these people do? Just because Edwin's dead doesn't mean that those poor and angry people that made up the Defias just suddenly disappear. In the newer version, the question's a little bit different, and it's got more to do with when the new version occurs. You've got to remember that this was the Cataclysm, so the problem is more one of futility. Because you leave here and you think, there's a giant metal dragon tearing up chunks of the world, and I'm here putting down a peasant revolt. Again. So, even when something's just a remake, it can have some actual significance and really mean something to a player if you're willing to take the time to become invested in it.
If you're invested in the storyline, this does provide, I think, an important cooldown period. Just you've kind of been through the darkened wood full of monsters, and now you are emerging back into the world of the living. And they take their time about this, but the reward at the end is pretty sweet.
Absolutely. So just the importance of sunlight, as I've said multiple times in this series, especially when you haven't seen it in a little while, it resonates so deeply with, I think, every person. You
Definitely.
Come out here and you've got this beautiful, peaceful expanse. You wouldn't know about the problems of the Defias. You wouldn't know about the problems of the Cataclysm. You've just got this very calm, very peaceful coastline.
This is what Stormwind should be. It should look like.
Absolutely.
And by going through all this, you've maybe brought the kingdom a little bit closer to that.
Absolutely. Well, folks, it was a little bit different, but that was the story of the space and how the space has told a story in the Deadmines. I've been Shuppzy. I hope you liked it. Next episode is probably going to be a little bit more traditional, but in future, might look into doing more co-commentaries or getting some other people onto the show if you guys enjoyed it, so let me know. Otherwise, have a great day, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me aboard.
Thank you, Destron.